Good evening, everyone. So wonderful to see you all tonight. What an amazing crowd we have here. This is so wonderful. I want to just a couple quick announcements before we get started, and then we're going to tuck into this wonderful evening. I'll just say first, we have our microphones, and I'll ask that as we speak, everyone please use the mics. For those that come to Torah study, you're pretty used to these. For those that maybe aren't regulars in this room, when it's red, it's muted. You push the button to unmute it. And part of the reason is, one, just so everyone can hear, because it's a large room, but also I want to let you know we are recording tonight. So if you don't feel comfortable being recorded, don't say anything, and we won't hear you. But we have a number of congregants, some that couldn't make it, some that are more virtual, and they've always said, I really want to listen to the discussion. I can't make it, but I really want to know what's going on. And so thank you all for that. I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful past president, leader in this congregation in many things, including Israel programming, Rick Berkman, to mention a couple really exciting upcoming events.
Well, I'm glad you're all here because it's on. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. We scheduled this book discussion before next week's speaker, Yehuda Kurtzer from Hartman Institute, partly because they're indirectly related. They're about Jewish identity, about what it means to be a Jew. I urge not just all of you, but all of your friends and people you invite to try and get people to come to this. He is a leading intellectual, both in America and Israel, on the problems of modern, I'll call it liberal Zionism in Israel, and how diaspora Jews relate to Israelis, particularly in light of the events of October 7th, 2023. Related to that, I'm starting a course I taught probably 10 years ago here from the Hartman Institute called I Engage, and it's about 3 pivotal events in Jewish history, modern Jewish history, that affect how we think of ourselves as Jews. The first was the Balfour Declaration, 1917. The second was the 1947 UN resolution recognizing a 2-state solution, and Israel accepted that. And the third was the 1967 war. And each of those events fundamentally changed how we as American Jews thought about being Jewish. There's a 4th event now. It's called October 7th. And that's not in this course, but indirectly it is, because that's really what Yehuda is going to be talking about, how the events of October 7th impacted our self-perception, both in Israel and outside of Israel, of what it means to be Jewish. So I please urge you all to come, bring as many of your friends as you can, invite other people, and I hope you'll come to the class. I'm not sure if our class is still at 10 to noon, I think.
I believe so. I think you can check the Rhode Hashem calendar to be sure. I can probably check it. It's
Steve,
definitely in the Rosenbluth seminar room. I know that much.
Okay, Steve.
10 to 12.
Steve reminded me the Yehuda event starts at 5:30 with a informal supper here for $36, and then the speech itself will be in the synagogue. Sanctuary, in the sanctuary, probably starting by 7. So you can invite your friends. The Yehuda thing is Tuesday, September 17th, and my class is this Sunday.
Norm, I think you're busy. Sorry.
September.
Exactly. Norm's one of our wonderful teachers at our Berkman McCosley Mood on Sunday. And so
you're busy for the class.
Busy educating our future 4th graders, right? Exactly.
Good.
So, but anyone else, you should come. It's an amazing class. Thank you, Rick. All right. let's tuck in. Why don't we, if it's okay, I'd love to just take a quick moment because I don't know if everyone knows each other here. And maybe rather than go around the room, just like we do at Shabbat, maybe just take like 1 minute, see if you can find someone new who maybe you don't know already. Introduce yourself, say a quick hello, and then we're going to tuck in. All right. I think I actually know everybody, which is wonderful. That's good. I don't always, but I know Annette over there. I know Risa. Risa right here. Risa, do you know Brian?
We're all members. We're all members.
All members, yeah. You guys have probably seen each other before, I would think, but yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. You usually see him first on the screen, then you see him walk in. Rosalie's always on the screen, exactly. It's hard. Oh,
Well, you can do what I do. Just, put the phone up on the dashboard of the car, listen in until you get here, and then walk in the room. You gotta turn your phone off, though.
all right. Hopefully some people met some new folks. Let's All right, let's come back together. And I sent out some guiding questions. I thought, we'll kind of look at some of those, but who knows where we'll go exactly with this discussion. I'll just say a couple things at the start. First of all, this was a hard book. Like even for a rabbi who is very much immersed in stuff, it wasn't, it was dense. He is smart. He definitely writes to I think to a high level and asks his readers to go there, which I really appreciate. And in some ways, I felt like this could have been a whole college level course, and in some ways almost would be better. I think I'd love for him to like teach this class, and for us to, or even maybe in a future time, we could almost like do this book as a class. And in some ways it might be better because it sort of breaks it out a little more, and you can kind of week to week and get more discussion after each section. But we have a chance in about an hour or so to see what we could gain from it. So I think I'll start where he does, with our denominations, which I thought was really interesting. And what I'd say is I really appreciate sort of how he breaks the mold. And what I loved was the fact that as I was reading it personally, I kept thinking, maybe I'm not a progressive Jew, even though I've always said I'm a Reformed Jew. But according to his analysis, I actually personally thought in some ways maybe I'm an evolutionist. And I really appreciate it in some ways. And I realized when I sent the questions out, I skipped the fourth, which was the godless Jews, right? Which he does not, and I say that facetiously because, of course, he's very clear that he's not disparaging with that. And actually, I would imagine there's many in our community who may be there as well. And I thought maybe I'm kind of a little bit of all of these, probably not the traditionalist, though. That's probably the one I could maybe say didn't work for me personally. But I guess I want to open up and say, let's start with that, because I think it's really important, one, for us to understand those definitions, because he uses that for the rest of the book, especially in understanding the relationship to Israel and how we all Jews, have a relationship to Israel, whether we like it or not, which I thought was really interesting, no matter where we are in that spectrum. And even if that relationship to Israel is one of, I don't want it, So what I'd say is, I'm interested to hear, what did you think of his sort of redefining the denominations in that way? Where do you place yourself in that? Even if you belong to a progressive Reformed congregation, maybe you don't think of yourself fully in that avenue of progressive, which he really defines as a theology of social justice, which I heard as sort of the main defining factor, which is one piece for many of us, but might not be all of it. And so, why don't we start there? What did people make of his definitions? Were there questions about them? And where do you place yourself in that? Rick, here, talk into there. So,
Maybe you can give your summary of the four definitions.
Sure. So he talks about the traditionalists, the evolutionists, the progressives, and the godless. The godless are those cultural Jews, right? Those Jews that define themselves by, I think he says bagels and lox is sort of his language around it, which I think is wonderful. And that's a lot of people in my life that I know. It's some of my own siblings. And again, he's not disparaging in that, which I think is really beautiful. And also for him, that's actually, those are the early Zionist pioneers who created the state of Israel, who really saw creating a national state and a national identity and an Israeli identity as actually supplanting and replacing that religious Jewish identity and that connection with God. He does a really nice job, I think, of highlighting, that famous phrase that's in Israel's Declaration of Independence, Tzur Yisrael, the rock of Israel, which was sort of this interesting compromise between the godless and the traditionalists in the early framing, that for the godless, this was the people, this was the land, this had nothing to do with God. And yet, of course, for the traditionalists, they, Tzur Yisrael, Kuma Be'ezrat Yisrael, would immediately connect this as one of the names of God. And so, sort of interesting. The progressives, which he sort of categorizes as Reform conservative Jews, are those that social justice has become the main theology and really the most important part of Judaism. These ideas of universal values, much more so than the particularism of the Jewish people, that the Jews are a light unto the nations, that in the wake of the Holocaust, never again means never again to anybody, right? Which would be contrary to others who would say never again to us, which is a much more particularistic look at it, and that's ultimately when we get to some of perhaps the traditionalists and evolutionists. Then we have the evolutionists, which is what I would say he himself is, which he defines as roughly modern Orthodox. Again, I see myself in a little bit of this, right? And he actually uses the story from the Talmud that he uses to talk about them is a story that I think some of you, especially if any of you come to Torah study, know well, because it's one of my favorite texts in the entire Talmud, which is the oven of Achnai. And some of you have heard me tell this story before. This is the famous story that really gives the rabbis their authority and really speaks to this idea of evolving Judaism, of rabbinic authority, and that, lo b'shamayim hi, the Torah is not in heaven, that it's in our hands to interpret and to work with. And then the fourth are the traditionalists, and this is usually Haredim is who he's talking about. When we talk about Haredi, we're talking about ultra-Orthodox. Let me just jump back for a second and just say in terms of relation to Israel, that in his definition of and this I thought was one of the most interesting things for me, and we can get more into it, but in his understanding of the evolutionists, these are the hilltop youth. These are the religious Zionists in Israel. These are a really dangerous, troubling, scary, I will say, group of Israelis that, when I began to sort of understand their view of Messianism and their understanding of sort of that the Messianic age is at hand and what that allows them to do. And this is already, if we've heard about, Itamar Ben-Gavir and Bezalel Smotrich, and some of the language that we're seeing out of them and other, and I don't want to use the word settler because not every settler is a settler, and I think that's important to understand. But we're really talking about the extremist ideological settlers, and I think the Hilltop Youth is actually the best terminology. And really the divide between that sort of sect of modern Orthodox evolutionists in Israel versus the American, which is quite different in what that looks like. And then lastly, the traditionalists, which is the Haredi, as I said. And, again, in relation to Israel, just sort of the understanding of their sort of weird kind of, we're not really gonna acknowledge Israel, because in a traditional sense, Israel should not come about until the Messiah, and yet we're all going to live there and live off the state and everything else, and especially their support of the IDF, but their real just hatred, I guess, of serving in the IDF, and yet they'll pray for the soldiers and they see the value of it. and yet the nature how, there was recently an ultra-Orthodox rabbi who was quoted as saying, secularism is worse than death, and how scared they are of what that universal enlistment would mean and other things. So I feel like I went a little more than maybe I should have, but a little bit about those four groups. So what did you make of them? What would you add to my definitions? What confusion do you have around them? And again, where would you place yourself, and what did you find sort of interesting about his redefinitions? And let's make sure we use the mic so we can hear from everyone. I hope we have enough of them. Maybe we can, if we have an extra one here, maybe Brian, that one can move down, and me and you can share if needed. Yeah, Alice, right into the mic. Let's hear what your thoughts
So
are.
I'm still confused, if that's okay.
Totally. And I don't know all the answers, so maybe there's someone else who can jump
Well,
in.
I'm confused about what the evolutionist Jews are and how that, I understand what you're saying about progressive or reform Jews, social
Yeah.
justice. Are you saying that the evolutionist Jews are the Messianic Jews in Israel? Yes?
Yeah.
That really got me very upset when I read about that in the book, because there are American Jewish groups,
So
very hugely it seems like they don't care about the liberal values of democracy and what Israel used to be. They just want to take over the land. Is that
So
the
it's-
evolution?
it's interesting because the evolutionist Jews in America is the modern Orthodox community, the way he defines it, which I think is much more nuanced, because they are looking to have liberal American values and traditional Jewish values, and have their cake and eat it too. And they do, for the most part. However, he's also very clear that if you look at the voting trends, the majority of them are voting Republican, because they see that as stronger for Israel. And so, although they might have in a previous generation not, which is sort of interesting. But he's he does talk about this same evolutionist stream of modern Orthodox Jews in Israel, and not all of them. There are plenty of modern Orthodox Jews who don't live in settlements and are living wonderful lives and are doing coexistence work and other things. But not all, it's one of those things. Not all evolutionists are Messianic Hilltop youth, but all the Messianic Hilltop youth are evolutionists in his understanding of that. Yeah. Yeah, Ellen.
So I had a little bit of a different take on the American evolutionists.
Yeah.
So because I sort of saw myself there. So
I
not,
did a little too. That's what I was saying.
yeah, so not so much, I understand that he posits that the modern Orthodox folks are evolutionists, but he's talking about looking at Torah as allegory and metaphor, which is what we do a lot of
Yeah.
here in Torah study, and on Talmud as representing many different points of view is what the evolutionists would be focusing on, I think, right? So, so I could see myself there.
I'm totally with you. And that's one of the reasons I like his definitions. And I was, for the sake of clarity, trying to sort of give those rough groups that he sees them corresponding to. But he also makes very clear that part of the reason he does this is he wants us to forget about the denominations for a second and to think about where would you put yourself. And maybe, you might not place yourself in exactly one or the other, or a little bit of both. That's wonderful. Yeah, Rick and then Steve.
How does he put the Hilltop youth in the same group with the modern Orthodox Americans?
Yeah, I think my understanding is he's and please, anyone else who'd like to jump in, it's ultimately their same understanding of that evolution of the law and the power of the rabbis that allows them to basically, on one hand, sort of accept. Because the problem with the ultra-Orthodox in terms of Israel is they're going to stick by this strict definition that Israel should only come about with the coming of the Messiah. And he speaks to, some of these very fringe groups like Neturei Carter, who go so far as to, protest along with Palestinians and meet with the Iranians and literally like, wear keffiyeh and they're almost doing it like a show. I kind of see them similar to like the Westboro Baptist Church. But that in order for them to not be the traditionalists and still believe that Israel should exist and that they should be a part of it, they have to have that evolutionary sort of understanding. That may be a little simplified. I don't know if others can speak to that more or want to have other ideas. Steve?
I sort of agree with your general approach, and that we'll recognize the progressives as reforms, et cetera, reconstructionists and conservatives. I would give the traditionalists a little wider berth and include maybe conservadox and people like that. But the thing I think, and I think he was unduly torturous in getting to his viable conclusion, by the way. But what I wanted to really say is that the evolutionist, I think, was a most confusing concept.
Yeah.
And I viewed evolutionist as a moving marker. Sometimes one group uses it, sometimes another. Any group could use it, the godless, the progressives, the traditionalists, because what it is really is a modern interpretation of exegesis. When something in modernity conflicts with maybe a traditional interpretation, you sent a good Jewish lawyer on it, and he comes up with a conclusion. So that's why we don't sacrifice anymore to get ourselves well. We use modern medicine. That's why we don't sacrifice our kids anymore. That goes back to Abraham, but that's a form of evolution as well. So I think evolution is a very wide concept which should be folded right into everything else about Judaism, almost with wrestling with God.
Love that. I was looking for just the passage. I'll just read a little. This may help clear up some of the evolutionist related. 193. The key evolution element in the religious Zionist reconception of the Messiah was the interpretation of the Messiah not as a single man, but as a collective. Some hints that aspect of the messianic narrative might not be literal could arguably gleaned from older Jewish sources. The major development toward a collective Messiah for religious Zionism seemed to have occurred when Rav Kook associated secular Zionists as a group with a figure the Talmud calls Messiah, son of Joseph. And he, again, goes into a lot of detail on this, but ultimately it's that idea of being able to evolve with the law while still keeping to traditional ideas, which is what modern Orthodoxy does, that allows them to reconceive this more modern idea of the Messiah and places them in that very movement and in that very time. And again, to me, that was one of the, I would say, scariest things that I read in this, because if people are messianic and they believe the end times are truly at hand, what sort of unspeakable acts will they do? And that's some of the things we've seen, sadly. And some of the violence we're seeing in the West Bank right now is very much because of that. And yeah. Someone else. Elisa, yeah.
Okay, green, okay. Definitely some confusion on the evolutionists, but I kind of get it. And as far as personal identity, I've had some of all of that in my life.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of things, that I identified with and that I didn't. But having, gone all the way through an Orthodox Jewish day school. So I definitely had the indoctrination, I suppose. And I do, like, some of the things that I remember were being told that to go to a conservative synagogue is worse than to go to a church.
Wow.
That's what we were told.
Wow.
Another one.
No, and that it's interesting because in some ways that almost feels traditionalist, right?
Yes.
Whereas we would often see modern Orthodoxy, if that's the type of,
it was
where you grew up, he says that's more
Somewhat
evolutionist, but in
modern.
this case, like that kind of statement to me speaks of traditionalism, right?
And also, I had my teacher in junior high school who was Neturei Karta.
Wow.
And Neturei Karta, where they believe
that's
not in the
the-
state of Israel at
yeah,
all.
exactly.
And they lived there. He lived in Israel. Somehow, somehow
It's
they're
a
able
little-
to.
little
but
hypocritical, one could
as,
say,
as
but-
you said about supporting the anything is better unless it's going to be perfect, and that
Yeah.
search for perfectionism is. But one thing that I think is important is that we're used to these the differentiations of the different groups in America, but we're not talking about the Sephardim. Now, Ashkenazim, 80% of Jews worldwide, but still leaves 20%. And they have a very different viewpoint. And you don't have this, the Sephardic synagogue everybody goes to.
Yeah.
And they're not really looking at what you're doing outside of the synagogue. So to me, it was beneficial that he had a more inclusive, that he could lead, not
I
just
love
assume
that.
that everybody is Ashkenazi.
Yeah, and I'll say that, to be a Jew today, in some ways, perhaps it should be called to be a Jew today in America in relation to thinking about Israel or something like that, because it's very American focused. And I think in general in America, we're very Ashkenormative, right? And the majority of American Jews are Ashkenazi. Most of our families came over in that big wave of Jewish immigration at the turn of the century, from Eastern Europe. And I think you're right. I think he does maybe a disservice to Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews. And there is obviously mention of them in terms of talking about Israel. I thought one of the interesting things he talks about in relation to sort of the Nakba, the expulsion of Palestinians from Israel, as well as the expulsion of Jews from Arab lands. And I've often done the same, and I was really happy to hear him say it, because I was like, oh, maybe I'm right in that. Comparing it to the transfer of Pakistan and India during the British time. And I thought, once again, it just reminds us that really the British are to blame for all of this. I think that's something we can all agree on, like all the mess in Israel, everything. Let's just blame the British for everything. But I thought that was one area where he did get into it a little bit. But I think you're right, Elisa. He doesn't fully sort of bring in the Mizrahi community or Sephardi community in America in terms of those and where they would fall. It would be interesting. I think they would probably fall in an evolutionist category by and large, but not necessarily. And yeah, interesting. Ellen and Mark, and then we'll come back around. Yeah.
Can I talk?
Remind me your name. Joanne. Why don't we do Joanne first, and then we'll go over to Ellen and then Mark.
Yeah. Well, I'm a visitor here.
Welcome.
And I belong to two congregations. I belong to a conservative congregation, and I belong to a Reconstructionist congregation. And I looked at the question about, which of the divisions might I fit into? And I came to the conclusion that I'm sort of an integrationist. Because there are things about the Lubavitch, what's happening?
Yeah, you're good. Keep going.
Okay, there's things about the Lubavitch that I just love, but I'm not going to be a Lubavitch. And there's things about the modern Orthodox that I love, but I'm not going to do it. And there's things about the conservative that feels to me like home because I was raised there. But they don't allow for enough lay participation, and that's why I like the Reconstructionists. And I had a phase of renewal, which he didn't mention in his book.
He didn't. And renewal, I think, would probably fall more under the progressive. I think for the majority of folks that I've met in the renewal, that universalist approach, that social justice, tikkun olam, is probably a leading factor in their understanding. Yeah, let's go over to Ellen and then Mark and then I think Bill.
Yeah, so I just, on page, like you can't really see the page on my Kindle, too bad. But there's a quote from, he quotes Rabbi Rahel Berkowitz.
Yeah,
who-
it's right around the same
who's an
spot that we were looking at in
yeah,
terms of
who's
the.
an evolutionist, and she says, when I see traditional Jewish texts that treat women as unequal, I have to either annihilate myself or annihilate my view of God, or I have to say that those texts have been influenced through time by human beings, and I think that's how he's distinguishing it from traditionalism.
I love that. I love that. It's somewhere in around the page, somewhere in the 80s, I think, is where she is. I see him mentioning her in 88. I don't know. Yeah, but I love that. Mark.
Thank you. Nobody has spoken up for progressivism.
Yeah.
For that and other reasons, I feel obliged to. do so.
Please.
It's what I grew up in from day one and have never been apart from. The emphasis, as I understand it, and I'm speaking about myself, I'm not meaning to set an argument with anybody, is on social justice. And in my mind, I don't create a conflict that needs to be mediated and resolved between social justice on the one hand and Judaism on the other. Rather, that is Judaism to me.
Well, that's kind of his conclusion, isn't it, in a sense? I love that.
And it requires, as you read Torah, possibly a different emphasis. That you choose different verses to be your exemplars of what the Torah is about.
Yeah.
That you know the heart of the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt is number one, as opposed to something that, okay, but, and that is where I am, and I've never varied from it. It has always been a good guide star for me. It's what Judaism has been about for me.
I love that. And I'll say, I think I think I could probably speak for one of our emeriti, Rabbi Fuchs, and to say, I think he would firmly place himself in that same camp. And for him, that is Judaism. It is the prophetic tradition. That was a big part about what classical, Reformed Judaism was all about. It was lifting up the prophets and really the main focus on that universal vision of Judaism as a light unto the nations, in Isaiah's words, right? And that was I think that's exactly right. Yeah. Bill, and then Marcia. I got some extra batteries, by the way. Do we need some, Lisa? Can I?
I just had a question about the term evolutionist.
Right into it, yeah.
You hear me now? A question about evolutionist. The impression I'm getting now is not exactly what I got from the book, but it may be better. That is to say, evolution usually means a change. Often in biology would be a change that makes something more adaptable to its environment.
Yeah.
But here it seems to me it's more a matter of this may be the most significant change. Moving the idea of Messiah from an individual to a collective, is that basically what you think it
I think that's
implies?
that's just for the evolutionists within Israel, and specifically those religious Zionists that he's talking about, and that's sort of a unique. I think for American evolutionists and as evolution as a whole, it really is about adaptability. I think it's modern orthodoxy. It's how do you maintain these traditions, have your cake and eat it too, but still be part of society, right? And that's exactly, I think, is 100% that. Yeah. Marcia, and we can go to Ruth after.
I was very confused about what it means to an evolutionist, particularly since he too talks about it being the most difficult of all of the themes, traditions he talks about. He says it requires holding two contradictory beliefs at the same time, but he also talks about remaining committed to the authority of God's law as interpreted by the rabbis.
Yeah.
And that's one of the major things Rabbi Fuchs has always talked about, that as a Reformed Jew, not as a conservative Jew or even a Reconstructionist Jew, but as a Reformed Jew, our rabbis are wonderful teachers and knowledgeable, but they are not the lawgivers.
That's exactly right.
And I
It's a
think
big difference.
the problem with the evolutionist Jew is they got to pick the right rabbis for their evolution. And we see that in the modern Israel of having the leadership of very radical rabbis leading these evolutionists. And that's why it's very clear to me that I certainly am not an evolutionist because of the importance of following the rabbi as opposed to Rabbi Kuhn's notion of learning enough to figure it out for yourself.
Beautiful. And I think that is, in Reform Judaism, this whole idea of personal choice, right, is huge. Informed personal choice. What I remember we learned when I was a kid in Hebrew school was choice through knowledge. That was like the phrase, right? And that was such a key, but it wasn't, and in some ways it's interesting. We talked about Reconstructionists. People often ask, what's the difference between Reform and Reconstructionists? And there's not a lot, to be honest, but there is some key things. And one of the key things that I often speak about is personal versus communal decision. And Reform is really focused on personal decision, which I think is what you're getting at, as opposed to Reconstructionists, which actually is much more about a community choice, and that people in that community are all gonna, it may be a very liberal decision, but everyone in that community is gonna live by that same thing, and there's a more uniformity there. So in some ways you could say, actually, Reconstruction is maybe a little more like evolutionist in some ways than Reform. That's why I think it's interesting that they don't fit exactly in those models. Ruth and then Fred.
To me, a rabbi is also an example of behavior and more than interpretation. And experience I had with this in a rabbi in a temple in Nashville who really fought for civil rights and would go on demonstration for the civil rights of the black population, African American population. And the rabbi who came after him organized trips to the mosques in Nashville and invited the Palestinians, whoever they were, to come to our synagogue for services. It was just a lovely situation where you felt everybody's part, human like us.
A lovely situation where you felt like everyone was human and part of us. Just repeating, because I think you cut out at the end there. Or there's more batteries somewhere. Sorry, we didn't get them charged. Oh, no! We tried. Fred.
There it goes. I had a little difficult time reconciling the definitions, but I'm not troubled by it. I wish I had met my great-grandparents because they were fourth cousins. My great-grandfather was Chabad, and my great-grandmother came from the Lithuanian tradition that derives back from the Lithuanian rabbis and the Gaon of Vilna. And it was the Gaon, who I believe was the rabbi, who started to, who believed in the Messiah being a collective, and encouraged.
I'm sorry about these mics, everyone.
Encouraged his disciples to move to Jerusalem in 1809 to establish a collective presence in the Holy Land. But I do think that has morphed over years to what you've described as being the hilltop youth kind of messianism. So that is a collective messianism on steroids now, and with much of a difference because it's racial and nationalistic as opposed to just being religious.
And it's interesting how he talks about how that sort of merger with the secular that sort of came in, and the way they were able to do that, with that sort of idea of nationalism, which I think is huge.
Yes.
And that actually speaks to that last category, which we haven't talked about as much, are the godless Jews, which create a God out of Israel, right? And create this, for them, the ideal would be that there wouldn't be Judaism anymore. I think he was a little bit broad strokes with that. It wasn't all of the early Zionists, but that idea that nationalism would become the new Judaism, right? And we can see that within that stream of religious Zionism, 100%. Yeah. Rick, wait, was there someone?
I think what this discussion demonstrates is that all categorizations of Jewish ideas have limitations. Limitations at the time they're developed, and limitations over time because they change. I liked your word integrationist. We're probably all integrationists in the sense that we take a little bit from each of these categories. I still like the reform movement's emphasis on not so much it being individual choice, because I do think there's a tension between, in our own American society, between too much individualism and not enough of collective acceptance, collective judgment, collective morality. Because if we're all individuals, there's no collective norms. So at some point, all of the issues we've raised, whether it's Zionism or Messianism or theology, belief or not belief in God, or parochialism versus universalism, those are all Jewish ideas that have been struggled with for years. And he starts in his introduction by saying, nobody quite knows which one he believes in, and the reason is, over his life, he's probably believed in all of them.
I love that.
So we all go through that process. I studied with a group of Christian scholars about how do Jews think and study. And at the end of 2 summers at the Hartman Institute, one of them said, I better understand how you Jews think. You ask an unending series of unanswerable questions.
Yes.
You got us. That's it. Okay, that was it.
I love that.
And
I
that's
love
what
that,
this
Rick.
book's all about.
And Mark kind of alluded to that before, that it's in the struggle. And I think, look, that's Yisrael, to struggle with God. And to me, I recently I've been listening to a couple podcasts of Feldman being interviewed in prep for today, just because it's sort of interesting and to refresh my memory a little bit. And one of the things he talked about in one of the podcasts that I loved was he said, you know, how many billion Christians and Muslims are there in the world? And what, 15, 16 million Jews? Now, even taking the Holocaust or other sort of things aside, like, what's going on there? Why were there so many others? And what he claimed in this podcast, I thought was an interesting theory, was those other religions offer peace. They offer comfort. They offer answers. And Judaism doesn't. We offer struggle. That's not a good sales tactic. You can have salvation, you can have peace, you can have comfort, or you can have struggle and fighting and arguing. Like, who's going to choose that? And it was almost flippant the way he said it, but I think there's a certain truth to it. And it's very interesting. I think for those of us that are Jewish, that were born Jewish or chose Judaism, I mean, actually, all of us chose Judaism even if we were born, because we're here, and you chose to be here. As Yitz Greenberg says, we are all voluntary Jews. We've embraced that struggle. We've embraced that dialogue, that conversation, that challenging. And so 100%, Rick, I love that. And Mark, yeah. Michael. Oh, let's get the mic just so, I know we can all hear you. I just want people on the recording to be able to, if they're interested, because I know it'll be profound.
Got it. So I understand the notion that from a marketing perspective, the struggle is not going to be a great, banner or sale. But look at us, how many people are here. We're here because we're questioning. And to me, I think that's one of the things that's kept me engaged in Judaism, is that there are so many different questions, interesting questions, and then the answers can be applied in different ways to various aspects of the rest of my life. It's that's what engages me.
I love that. That's absolutely beautiful. Elisa, yeah.
I was just kind of going in a mind game. How would this book be different if it had been written by a woman?
If the book was written by a woman, I think it's a great question. What do people think? Yeah. Ellen, what do you think? I love that question.
Well, this is superficial, but I thought of that right at the beginning of the book, right at the beginning when he talks about Haredi Jews, and he says they're black and white. And I said to myself, who's black and white? The men are black and white. The women are far from it. beautiful clothes and wraps for their hair, and the absolute opposite of black and white. And I thought that exact thing, that he was, that it was male focused. And another thing that he did, which was interesting, is he often referred to God as he. He says, "I understand God's not
Yeah.
gendered, and God has
It's what
no
I grew up with,
body."
right? Yeah.
But then there it was. So yeah, I thought that too.
I think that's the black and white piece. If I can just say a minute, he tells that story of the gray. He ends up getting the gray, whatever, fedora.
Schreimel.
Yeah. But what's so interesting about that, Ellen, is obviously he's playing around with this idea of black and white, that it's the physical, right? They wear black and white,
And they
but that
think
they
black.
also think in black and white. And what you said, I don't know if you meant this, but I would agree that the women, and from my understanding, women within the ultra-Orthodox spaces also aren't just not black and white in their physical appearance, but I think there's been this sort of tradition of the women have a different kind of knowledge that's passed on, and that there's sort of like, it's not as formal. And this is just from some of my reading, Sue Fishkoff and other authors who have explored Haredi communities, but that the women sort of have this different view and different understanding that is perhaps more gray and more fluid and allows more than the men in their lives. That's really interesting. And I'll say, we even see that actually in the Talmud a little bit, and I'll make a plug. Gila, I forgot her last name now, but a brand new book all about women in the Talmud, and it's a fantastic, fantastic book that I'm reading right now. I want to make sure we get to some other topics. We're kind of moving all around, which is great. There was one that I was really interested in, and that was the idea of chosenness, which I thought was fascinating. It's something we really struggle with, and I think it's important. And I was very interested in sort of, again, he goes back to the different types of Jews to understand this. Something that jumped out to me that I'd never thought of before, and I love the way he explored it, is this Jewish pride in like famous Jews. And I love the way this is just one of the things that I'm going to take away, because I'm thinking about this. I was just watching the Olympics, as many of us were, and I was so excited. I've been following her nonstop. This Israeli Jewish, she's American, Israeli-American, but Jewish young woman from California, Amit Elor, who won the gold in women's wrestling in like the 68 kilogram category. She's incredible. And I was like so excited. I was a high school wrestler, love wrestling, but why was I so excited that this person who I've never met before in my entire life, I don't know her, but I feel pride that she won the gold. And I just thought how he views that as a sense of secular chosenness was really interesting. I also think how he I think he might have been a little bit black and white in his understanding of progressivism's view on chosenness, the way it's just sort of completely tossed out the window, which I don't know if I would fully agree with, in favor of universal sort of values. But then, yeah, I don't know. I want to hear more from you. What do you make of the idea of chosenness? How do you think that sort of affects these different Jewish streams and also in our understanding of Israel? Yeah, Paula.
There's a YouTube interview from Harvard Hillel with him that's an hour long, and it's really worth listening to. One point he made in that was that the ultra-Orthodox believe they're chosen, they are serving fighting by studying.
Yeah.
And if something happens like October 7th or something, they say, we didn't study hard enough. So that, kind of also brings in the question of spirituality. And something related to the progressives, he said, he was asked, well, is there hope for these young people, that feel like, the Israeli government and everything is not supporting social justice? What will be the answer for them to stay connected to Judaism? And he said it would be through spirituality, mysticism, like going back to like the Kabbalah, and he said the concept of angels, So I thought, I just like that quite a bit, and going back to the first question for myself, yeah, the integrationist is great because I mentioned in Torah study, I went to Gratz College, and I had to learn Mishnah and Gemara. I find that wherever I am, I want to take the other point of view. Like when I'm at a Passover Seder and they don't want to read the Haggadah, now I'm like, no, we should read the Haggadah. When I was young, it was like, oh, why do we have to read the Haggadah? So it's kind of like, you know.
I'll add on to what you said, and one of the things I actually really appreciated was, and it's something, you know, myself, Rabbi Mader, our whole congregation has been saying, is that especially those young Jews who have been at anti-Israel protests, who have been incredibly critical, sometimes I will be very honest, making me feel really uncomfortable and pushing my own, you know, and I consider myself pretty liberal, but really going farther than I would go and making me feel uncomfortable even. This is their Jewish values at work. This is what we taught them. This is values of Tikkun Olam. This is values of universalism. This is their understanding of chosenness, that it is universal and that it is not unique to the Jewish people and that we have an obligation to the Palestinian people. And I think we need to just remember that they're good Jews, right? I don't know if people all heard he says it in the beginning, I think, and he said it in a lot of interviews, what he was originally going to call the book, Bad Jews. That was his original title. I think he felt like post-October 7th, it was just too flippant and not, but there's a great little sketch with the comedian Zach Galifianakis and Paul Rudd, and he says, oh, I hear you're a practicing Jew, and Paul Rudd says, I'm not practicing, I perfected it. Such a great line. There's no such thing as a perfect Jew. There's no such thing as a bad Jew. And I appreciate that, I think, and that I think he does a nice job of saying that. More more about the chosenness idea or others. Brian.
One of the most interesting concepts of chosenness was unlocked by a fellow Torah study member, Carl Schneider, who talked about henotheism. And he's pointed out that henotheism.
Henotheism is the Henotheism. Heno or henotheism is, so we have polytheism and we have monotheism. Henotheism is somewhere in the middle, and it is the theology of the Torah, if you really understand it. True universal monotheism, the way we think of Judaism today, one God, everything, everywhere, all of that really doesn't begin coming about until the prophets, until the exile, 586 BCE. The Israelite cult before that was henotheistic. I think I don't remember which. And what it meant was that our God, Yahweh, Yud He Vav He, whatever we want to call this being, is our God. And our God can beat up all your other gods. And this is the one God we're going to worship. But there's actually a recognition that there are other national deities out there. Think of the whole idea of the Passover story, and much of the idea of the 10 plagues is our God can beat up your gods. I've often talked about this, think about the 9th plague, which is should be a big deal. It's darkness. Why is darkness such a big deal? God blotted out Ra, the sun god. That's what's the big deal? Darkness. Well, no, Ra's their chief god. And we just took him out, right? And then ultimately, the 10th plague, the killing of the firstborn, is not just killing of the firstborn. It's deicide. Because who is God killing? The next Pharaoh, who is a god, right? So that is henotheism. It's this recognition that there are other gods, but that our God is the only God we're going to worship, and that our God can beat up your gods.
Right.
Sorry, Brian, continue.
No, thank you for explaining. So it starts out really innocently. And the innocentness is that every people, has their own God. We all have a right to a team captain, and that's our team captain. And we know this is true, as you pointed out, is that even in the 10 Commandments, it says, thou shalt have no other gods before me, plural, sort of acknowledging the existence of other gods. But what somewhere along the line, and maybe you can isolate that point, our religion took on the view that there is one and only one life force for everybody, and but they still maintain this notion that that's he's our team captain, and he's still looking out for just us, and that can become dangerous when it's sort of the ultimate way to other people by looking at them as less than and unblessed.
I love that. I mean, I don't love that we do that, but I love that idea. That's absolutely beautiful. Let's hear Rosalie.
Well, I just have questions because I'm still reading and rereading the book, and I'm less than halfway through. But I love the sweep of it, especially the history part for me. And so thinking about the Chosen, it's a really interesting part of how history has affected who we think are the chosen, the sweep of history. When, just in my own lifetime, I remember what my parents thought, what my husband, who was 15 years older in another generation, thought were the Jews were the chosen, and what my contemporaries feel about that issue. And I don't have an answer of how or why it's changed, but it seems to me it's steeped in the sweep of our Jewish history, and even of World War II. I mean, right after World War II, it was God is dead, and somehow we had to revive him. And how we've revived him, I don't really understand all the differences, but I know that there are differences between evolutionary and traditional and reform, etc. But I want to really know how they've impacted each other and what people think about each other's views in this time. Because saying I'm the chosen sounds terribly awful to me now, but I don't think it did to my parents.
I really appreciate that line, and especially what you said, Rosalie, about what are we hearing from each other? What are we listening from each other? How are we understanding this from each other? Because I think that's so much of the end of the book, right? That even those whose very ideas seem, for someone who believes in chosenness, to still have the ability to learn from and listen to someone who maybe doesn't think that's an idea that works for them at all, and how we have that dialogue is huge. I loved his the story of Elisha Ben Abuya. Again, it's like he's got all the good ones in here. These are like, you've probably heard some of these from me before. They're all like, it's a collection of the best Talmudic tales, the best Torah stories, right? And if any of you have ever read As a Driven Leaf, of course, Milton Steinberg, that's the story of Elisha Ben Abuya, sort of fictionalized. But this whole idea that this apostate, right, this someone who, acher, he's known as the other, right? And yet, he continues to teach Rabbi Meir. They continue to be in relation. They, his daughter comes to Yehuda HaNasi for help. I mean, it's really something quite beautiful about it, actually, and a beautiful, perhaps, message of agreement. And maybe that brings us to, and feel free to answer more about chosenness, but I also want to come to this idea of the family. And to me, that is, I think, for him, and I've heard him talk about it in so many different interviews and other things, I think for him, that is one of the biggest takeaways of this whole book, is that the Jewish people are a family in all their dysfunction. And I'm interested in, and he talks about Jacob and Esau, which I love, both Jacob struggling on his own, but also, and again, it's one of my favorites of the Torah, right? This moment, 22 years later, where they reconcile, where they fall on each other's shoulders, weeping. And he says, right, to see your face is to see the face of God. What would it look like if we all did that within our Jewish world? Yeah, so what if folks, more on chosenness, or I'd love to hear your take on the family. Rick.
Before we get to family, I want to get to...
I don't know if you're on, Rick.
Or just closer.
Oh, man.
Big pain.
I've got to warm him up with that hand.
Shake it around.
Let me just try that.
Start with this one. Yeah, this seems to be working.
Before I get to family, I want to focus on one thing he says that I think is important to us, and that is that our views of what's important in Judaism change over time. So he talks about what constitutes a firing act for a rabbi. It used to be you couldn't get on the bema and say, I don't believe in God, or you'd be fired. Every rabbi can get on the bema, except maybe in the traditionalist group, and say, I don't believe in God, okay? But there are two, he says, are left over. You have to believe the Holocaust took place and had significance, and you have to believe in the right of Israel to exist. And I thought to myself, have we turned Israel into the golden calf? Are we making Israel the idealized thing that holds us together? I agree. Whether we like it or not, Israel affects our relationship to Judaism, to our identity as Jews, whether we like it or not, to other people's view of us as Jews. But I still am worried that the ethno-nationalist trend, and remember, Zionism started as a nationalist movement and has now become an ethno-religious nationalist movement, sort of conflicts with our diaspora view of democracy and liberal independence and individuality. And so I ask, at what point do we say this is a golden calf and we don't want to pray to it?
Thank you, Rick. That was really beautifully said. Yeah, Paula.
I think we interpret chosen as meaning you're chosen for good things, but maybe we're chosen to struggle. That's what it's about. I mean, again, Tevye Fiddler on the Roof said, I know we're chosen, but maybe you could choose someone else for once in a while. You know, he refers, Noah Feldman, about, you know, Moses and David, you know, he said, who was good in his professional life, but he had some problems in his personal life. And Ellen and I were gossiping before the meeting today about Noah Feldman, who's also very complicated. I mean, he had this traditional thing, but his first wife was Korean, and he had 2 sons, and now he's engaged to a woman who's not Jewish, and he's, you know, has his own kind of like confusion and personal struggles, which I found kind of interesting.
I didn't know about that. That's really interesting. I didn't go into sort of his personal life too much, so it's very interesting. Right? There we go.
Can I just address one thing that Rick said that,
Yeah.
and I don't want to get away from family, I apologize. But there was one thing in the book that he emphasized that I thought was an interesting take, and it goes to what Rick said. What 2 things could you not get away from? What, Holocaust and Israel. It was interesting how he talked about what traditional Zionism was and how the Zionists it as a secular nation.
Yeah.
But how the world accepted it, the non-Jewish world accepted it because it saw it as a way to make amends for the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And as a result, he says, the world writ large expects the Jewish state. It looks as the Jewish state, as the Jewish people, to behave
to be better,
differently than other states. And that is something about chosenness, I suppose, in a different view, coming from non-Jews, the way they may look at that. I found that to be a very
love that,
interesting
Fred.
part
And
of the book.
I'll pick up because I actually have a section of that. It's one thing I had flagged here because last Torah study, we actually looked at in Parshat Shoftim just a couple days ago, we looked at how they wanted a king. And what's the language they say in Deuteronomy? Very clearly, they say, give us a king so we can be like all the other nations. And Feldman really picks up on that and actually then looks at the text from Samuel, which we also looked at in Torah study, and he makes it very clear. I want to emphasize how this passage captures in literary form the idea the Israelites wanted to be a nation like any other, right? And that's the early Zionists, right? They wanted to just be a little state just like everybody else. We got our state, Sudan's got theirs, so-and-so's got theirs, right? And nothing special. I think that's so huge, Fred, and that how the rest of the world saw it very differently. Yeah. I'll also say he talks about, and I found this helpful, and I can't remember if this is in the book or in an interview, where one of the things I think we often get upset about is the double standard that is applied to Israel. And I think this speaks to that in some way, and it offers some understanding of that. But also, I think he had another piece to it, which is we often say, okay, you know, you're protesting this. Well, what about Sudan, where 300,000 people have been killed or something? You know, I don't remember the numbers. I think that, or you know, why is everyone? And he's a little bit generous in this, I will say, to the non-Jew who is protesting, who has no connection, and he says he compares it actually with India and China, and he goes, if you look at the newspapers in India and China, they say almost nothing about Israel compared to what we see in Western media. Why? Because the majority of people in India are Hindu, and if you look at Hindu texts, they never mention Jews or anything about Judaism. Majority of people in China, they don't, but the majority of people in America and the West are Christian. And Christian, they know Jews. It's in their very text. Israel is very important. It's at the core, and it's part of the reason why there is such a focus on it. And I thought that was an interesting sort of, for me, it was actually a little bit helpful and disarming, because it's something that gets me upset sometimes when I see this, and I'm like, you're not protesting that? Like, you're not, you know, and if you're Jewish or you're Palestinian, you have every right to be protesting, and this is, you know, you got skin in the game. And it's the random, like, Christian that I'm like, why are you picking this? Why don't you pick that? And I think he had a really interesting reason behind that. In addition, Fred, to your point that you lift up around the Holocaust, which I thought was really, really important. Ruth.
To me also, this was a very important part of the book to read, because, you know, we all think everybody's picking on Israel, and why are they picking on us? Israelis feels this way, for sure. You know, we are just doing our thing, and the world is always picking on us. United Nations always passes the declarations against us, and so forth. I thought the correction of history, supposedly, of the Holocaust by creating Israel was agreed upon by 160 countries that agreed that the Jews should have a place of their own. So it kind of elevates this. It's not just a country that by accident happened 2,000 years ago. It's something that was really a conscientious effort of the world. So of course they expected more than just any country.
Yeah.
But there is another thing, and that is we tell ourselves that we are better than everybody else. So if we are telling ourselves we are better, then the others want us to be like that.
Yeah.
And the third is that Israel declared to be a democracy and liberal and so forth, which is really like a European country, not like Sudan and not like China. And therefore, the expectations are that Israel will behave that way.
He talks about that, and I love that you lift up that point, right? That this is a country in the middle of the Arab world, and nobody's talking about the same sort of things within Syria or Iraq or places like that. And he admits that some of that's kind of racist, right? It's like pejorative, the way we're like, oh, those you know, barbaric people, that's what they're going to do, and that's fine. We'll allow them. That's not what I actually believe. I'm speaking in that voice, of course. And that Israel having that European sort of idea behind it, they hold it to European values. I thought that, I'm glad you lifted that up. I think that was a really, really important point. Rich, here, grab a mic so we can hear you. You gotta make it green and talk right into it.
Hello. So about this, closer?
Yeah.
Okay. About this chosenness. So I always think about American exceptionalism. And the one person who didn't like this especially was Putin. He said, American exceptionalism, that's going to get you into a lot of trouble. I don't usually agree with Putin, but I do agree with him on that. What makes us so special as Americans? You could find things, I'm sure you can, but there are other countries in the world and I think the same can be said of Jews. There are a lot of things which makes us special and chosen, but we just need to be a little quiet about that. And we just need to be, you know, do our own thing and hope that in our own life, in our own ways, that we make a good place for ourselves.
Interesting. A couple years ago, we looked at a book called The Triple Package by Amy Chow and Jed Rubenfeld. It was one of our book club ones. I don't know if anyone remembers it. I'll say I think the book is filled with a lot of problems, and I'm a little critical of it, but it's a very interesting supposition. And these are, if people don't know, they're husband and wife sociologists, I think Yale maybe, and Amy Chow, is the one who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mom. She's Chinese American, he's Jewish, and in this book, they talk about various ethnic groups in America and why they think they have historically done better than other groups who perhaps immigrated at the same time period. And they look at Jewish Americans, particularly Ashkenazi, who came over sort of turn of the century, at the same time as Irish and Italian. They look at Cubans as distinct from other Hispanic, Latino groups. They look at Mormons, and the supposition the hypothesis in the book are there are three qualities that are unique to these groups. And the first two I think are the most interesting. The third one sort of feels a little separate, but it's a sense of exceptionalism, a sense of chosenness, coupled with a sense of persecution. And they say those two together. And then the third is the ability of like delayed gratification, which they say is inherent in a lot of these traditions. It always felt like the two make sense together, and that one's kind of a third. I don't know. There's a lot of problems with the book. Some of their, and a lot of criticism on sort of pseudoscience and other things. All that being said, it's a very interesting idea. That idea, I think, specifically of chosenness coupled with persecution, and how those two together sort of really create a unique psyche, not just among Jews, but among some of these other groups in America that we see some similarities with. Yeah. Ellen.
I like very much the way he talks about chosenness for evolutionists, American evolutionists, that it says they use allegory to say that to be chosen by God means to establish a special relationship with God, which other people can have too. The relationship need not be unique. This approach can allow evolutionists to avoid the collective narcissism of believing God has chosen only the Jews. They can choose to live as though chosen by God, by taking chosenness not to be exclusive. I love that.
I love that. And he brings in that text from Amos, if people remember, which is such a good text, because I don't know if people remember this one, but it's like when I first read this text, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or something, I'd never seen it before, and it like blew my mind. Amos says, just as I brought you, this is one of the prophets, just as I brought you, Israelites, out of Egypt, know that I also brought the Cushites out of Nubia, and I brought the so-and-so people out of so-and-so. And now we have to remember, this is the prophetic tradition, right? So we're talking already a later point from the Torah, where we've become somewhat more universal in our theology. But the fact that a prophet writing, 2,500 years ago is saying, I'm the universal God. I also liberated these people. They also had an exodus. Blows my mind. That's like a really kind of cool, right? And I think, Ellen, I don't know if that's in that section, that same section. If people, maybe someone remembers, I can look up Amos. I want to see chapter 9 or something. But yeah, I found that fascinating. Rick?
Coming back to peoplehood, I'm curious if you have a view when this concept of peoplehood really arose in the Jewish tradition, because I think it's a very modern concept, one we haven't come to complete grips with, and one that I think Yehuda's going to talk about, which is how we relate to these other cultures that really are very different from us, and we have no really common experience, life experience. Even our rituals aren't necessarily the same. And so why have we developed this concept of peoplehood, and where does it come from in the ideal world? Who developed it? It's not in the prophets, it's not in the Torah. Where is it?
Oh, I love that. I just want to tell 290 if you're interested, the text from Amos, just because it's really so interesting. What's that? Are you not as children of the Ethiopians unto me, O children of Israel, said the Lord? Have not I brought up Israel out of the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Kaphtor, and the Syrians from Kir? We're not so unique, right? So Rick, coming back to your question, what makes us a people? Where did that come from? What do you think? Lisa?
Well, I think some of it came from the fact that there's so few of us left in the world. And so thinking about it as a more modern concept, I think that's sort of where I think it comes from, is that there's just not a lot of us. I think that's also why, to your question earlier, Rabbi, about why do we get excited when we find out someone well-known or someone that's accomplished something is Jewish. It's because there's not a lot of us. So I think I remember my grandfather, that was always his thing. We'd be in the middle of he'd be reading the paper and he'd find out somebody was Jewish and he would get so excited to tell us who this person was. So I think that's where it comes from.
I was talking with someone earlier and they were asking, what's another group that's like around the same number? Baha'i. There are about 16 million Baha'i in the world as well. Just kind of interesting. And if we're looking at numbers, like, what does that say? And to the Baha'i, now it's a much more modern religion, which I think is an important note. It's only, it's less than 200 years old, I think. And it's more geographically located in the Middle East, they're definitely in America and other places. But I would wonder, how would the Baha'i, when there's like a Baha'i movie star, did they get really excited? Is it the same? I don't know. I'm interested. I'd be interested to see that as a comparison to sort of as one way of understanding. Is it about the numbers? What does that mean? How can we view ourselves compared with other groups of similar size? Because when we look at Christianity or Islam, which is what we're often compared with the other monotheistic faiths, like it's crazy. You guys know the joke that there's a Jewish guy who's talking with a Hindu guy, and they're in Mumbai, and the Hindu asks, how many Jews are there in the world? And the Jewish guy says, about 16 million. And the guy from Mumbai says, no, in the world, not just in Mumbai.
Yeah, exactly. That's true.
Because guess what? There are 16 million Hindus just in Mumbai. There might be more than that, actually. I think the numbers, Lisa, it's huge. Yeah, let's hear a few ideas. Let's hear from Marcia.
One of the things that makes us a people, or keeps us all together despite various traditions and cultures from other lands, is that we have a book. And it's the book, the people of the book. We all read the same book, just like we have Book of the Month, and we have Book of Philadelphia's book, one book, reading the same book. And Christians have the same thing, and the Muslims have the same thing. They have their books, and the people of different cultures and languages read the same and interpret the same book. That's, I think, what makes us a people, not our numbers, but that we keep reading the same book. And not long ago, Evangelico, I guess, was hawking, the New Testament, and he wanted to give me a copy, and I said, "Oh no, thanks. I'm still reading the old one."
Still reading the old one.
But it's this book that has so many possible interpretations and all the commentary that keeps us busy reading and talking into the night late, that makes us this one people of different languages and different backgrounds.
Beautiful, beautiful. Paula?
Well, I can't resist. I know you like baseball. So about a month ago, there was an event that happened only 3 times in the history of baseball, and that is the pitcher, Lazar, the catcher, Stubbs, and Peterson from the Diamondbacks were all, at the same time, and apparently that was only the third time in 135 years that there have been 3 Jewish players at the same time. That was kind of exciting.
No, but it's exactly like it gets a news article about it, like enough that it's exactly right. I want to come back to the family because I think that's related to it all. And I want to hear a little more about how you all see that metaphor, because that really is central to what Feldman's talking about, that dysfunctional family. And yeah, I'm interested in your thoughts on that, and if that's a metaphor that works for you, for the Jewish people, and perhaps how you relate to that. Ruth?
I think as a family, we are proud when somebody does well.
Yeah.
And we are really disturbed if somebody does something terrible. So I know when I saw news about, what was his name? Madoff, for instance.
Yeah, Bernie Madoff, great example.
Oh, God.
Shonda, Elisa, exactly.
Shonda. It's kind of puts all of us in bad spot.
Yeah.
Makes us look bad.
It's
And
not
I
good
think
for the Jews.
I think the same goes in families when one of the members is acting illegally or and inconsiderate of others, etc.
And then I think the natural question that I ask from that, Ruth, is then what do we do about it? There are some families who say we're going to sweep it under the rug and we don't want anyone to know this secret in our family, right? And there are others who say, no, we're going to, we need to shout this from the rooftops that Uncle so-and-so is not safe and people should know, don't hang out with him, and we need to, right? And I guess I think that's one of the crucial questions that we often ask in the Jewish community, that, look, I don't know if there's a full right answer here, and but that when we see other Jews doing things that we find morally reprehensible, do we stay silent because there are enough people already criticizing and we don't need more people to pile on our family? Do we stand by our family no matter what? Or do we also speak out against our own family? And what does that look like? And I think those are crucial questions for today in terms of our relationship to Israel and other areas of Jewish life. Yeah, other thoughts on family, or maybe that one in particular, if what if someone in your family, we kind of talked about, we get a lot of pride when someone's doing well, when we have someone in our family that maybe we're ashamed of and we're embarrassed by. What does that look like? Ben-Sion, did you want to add something? Let's get the mic so we can hear you. Even if it's just one word, I want everyone to hear that word.
One word, 2 letters. Am Yisrael.
People. Yeah, what does that mean to you, though? What does it mean to be a people?
Somehow we're related.
Somehow we're related. Not genetically necessarily.
Not genetically.
Yeah. Emotionally. I love that. That's beautiful. Marsha, you want to add more?
I think of Yom Kippur coming up, and we're all going to go.
Al Chet Shechatan, new.
Yeah.
New in Hebrew means us, our.
If Bernie Madoff did it, we're all responsible. We're a community, and we're charged with protecting each other and keeping us within the fences.
Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Lezeh. All of Israel is responsible for each other. Yeah. Isaac Luria, in his sort of understanding of sin, the famous Kabbalist, talked about as a body, the Jewish people as one body. So I love that analogy. It also worked for the spiritual Zionists like Achad Ha'am, who saw that, and they saw Israel as the heart, beating blood into the diaspora, which was all part of the body, but that you need the brain, you need the legs, you need all part of it. They didn't see it as a negative. But I already lost my train of thought. Right? Exactly. Isaac Luria said with his understanding of teshuvah, repentance, the high holidays, the same idea, that we're all one body, and that if we cut off our finger, we can still bleed to death if we don't fix that finger, even if we're in the foot or in the head or something else, right? How easily that can affect. Yeah, Ruth?
What's the difference between peoplehood and a nation?
So in Hebrew, Am can mean nation or people, right? It's actually kind of the same word in Hebrew. Now, I'll say nation, I think, carries with it in English some of the idea of modern nationalism, which is really it's a 200-year-old idea, right? This is a very new idea. There were no, nation states, and Zionism comes out of that very modern idea of a nation. So at least for me, I think that's one of the differences, at least in the English, that I associate, but maybe there's more to it. I don't know if others have ideas, and where does family play into that? Yeah, other thoughts? Rick.
It is true that in our Bible, family is a major theme, and it includes telling the worst stories about our family, not just the best stories. And it may be that this idea of all Jews are responsible for one another is a long-standing biblical or rabbinic interpretation and responsibility of Judaism, of Jews. So, but I agree with you that the nation of Israel is not the same as the people of Israel. And one of my conflicts with modern Zionism as it was founded was it wanted to discard 2,000 years of diaspora as somehow an aberration, and it hasn't yet come to grips with the fact that we were a continuation and part of that body, and therefore we need to be. And some modern Zionists, some even Israelis, will tell you that Ben-Gurion did. He said, if we are going to be the nation of the Jewish people, then the Jewish people have a right to have an opinion.
Yeah.
So he acknowledged that.
That's beautiful.
But there is a funny story about Ben-Gurion in this Ben-Gurion-Blaustein negotiation over the relationship of American Jews to Israeli Jews. They finally, after bitter letter writing, reached an agreement. And the agreement was that American Jews would support the founding of the State of Israel and the survival of Israel, and Israel would stop proselytizing and encouraging every American Jew to make Aliyah to Israel. And as they signed the agreement, Blaustein had brought his whole family to Israel because they wanted to sign it in Israel. And he brought his whole family, and he said, "Thank you, Prime Minister, for reaching this agreement." And the Prime Minister said, "You're fine," and turned to his son, "When are you going to move to Israel?"
When are you going to move to Israel? He said that to us.
That was great, Rick. Thank you. Final thoughts. What does it mean to be a Jew today? What do y'all think? Elisa, what do you think?
Well, I just felt like the idea of the Jews being a family, that resonated with me very much, and something that ties so many aspects in my own life and my own experiences. And when I look at my own family, I go from everything from my uncle who married his wife, each of them thinking that the other was not Jewish. And
Wow.
that was on one side, and on the other side, my cousins, the ultra-Orthodox side of the family. So I've got, huge. So what encompasses all of that? Well, that idea that we can be, that we're, dysfunctional. Many, we got the good people and the ones we like and the ones we don't like and the ones that we fight with, but that some kind of sense of family helped me to say, okay, I have a place in this.
Yeah, beautiful. Other thoughts? What does it mean to be a Jew today? Brian?
So, thinking about being a Jew in diaspora, this conversation has wound in that direction. I'm thinking that if you look at the United States, Canada, Great Britain as three examples, and to varying extents other Western countries which are liberal democracies and have the rule of law and rules-based systems, we as Jews are dependent on that liberalism that says you can wear your hair any way you want to, with payas or a single braid coming out the back, or long or short or whatever, and you should not be discriminated against or wear a kippah and not wear a kippah. I'm leaving France out of this because they have a different approach. But we have had the greatest, if I read this Jewish history correctly, we have had the greatest amount of freedom in these three countries ever in the history of Judaism with a lack of, where barriers came down, opportunities for employment, opportunities to become, vice president or whatever. We haven't broken that that other ceiling.
Yeah, Lieberman, he talks about that. I mean, that was huge.
But we've been in every sphere of life. We have medicine, law, and everything else. We've been, so blessed, and we have to protect that, and we have to stand up to those who say that, it doesn't work for us now, so therefore we're going to denigrate the rule of law. It's not great, not good. So that's part of our struggle.
Well, Feldman does make all the points you mentioned, and a few others. We squabble, we're this and we're that. But I really I think it was Marcia who said, what we really have, in addition to everything else, is we have the Torah. And even if you're a godless Jew, they know what the Torah is, and some of them really don't know the difference between Jacob and Isaac, maybe, but they get the very general idea.
I love that, and I love that throughout the text he uses Torah, right? And he roots so much of what he's talking about in Torah. And when I say Torah, I mean Torah with the big T, right? Not just the first 5 books, but when we say Torah, we mean the corpus of all of Jewish learning, right? Which includes Talmud and later, and prophets and everything else. And throughout the book, that's what he does. He keeps turning back to that, right? He ends with Elisha ben Abuya and then with Jacob and Esau. And someone earlier said, which I loved, that our Torah isn't perfect. Torah is actually really dysfunctional. And if you were to, it almost doesn't make sense. And if you look at other sacred books, Muhammad doesn't make any mistakes. Jesus doesn't make any mistakes. Our patriarchs and matriarchs mess up every single moment they have. And there's something incredibly beautiful about that. I was talking with one of our wonderful past presidents, Lloyd Brotman, and I had made a mistake on something with the high holiday honors, and Lloyd said to me, he said, it's not about the mistakes. It's how you deal with it afterwards. It's what you do about it. And I loved that, and that's such a Jewish idea, and that's so much of I think what Feldman's talking about, and what that we're gonna mess up. We're gonna have the struggles. Our patriarchs did. It's not gonna be perfect, but what are we going to do about it? And how are we going to continue to live our lives and make meaning and all of that? Yeah, beautiful. Other final ideas on what it means to be a Jew today? Yeah, Bill and then Marcia.
Something that impressed me with this is that it is so inclusive. It talks about varieties of Jews.
Yeah.
And when he gets to struggles with God, frankly, I'm not exactly sure what he means by with God. I see it as struggles with your understanding of morality, and you get that from Judaism, certainly. But just there are struggles not only with our own feelings about what's right, but struggles with each other, where we have very different feelings about what's right. I think it's a beautiful ending.
Love it. Marcia?
It seems so obvious, but to be a Jew today means that you have to deal with the elephant Israel in the room, and we all have to have some kind of an opinion and knowledge about it. And we need to be able to share that with each other because we are a community in a respectful way as we listen to the multiple views of the conflict today. That's, I think, a defining feature that I didn't pick about being Jewish, but that we all in this room and outside are dealing with.
That is so powerful, and I can't remember if he brings this text in. I think he does. Maybe it's in a different book I've been reading. But the famous Midrash at Mount Sinai, tell me if he did have it in there, if you remember it, that the people are at the base of the mountain. And the commentary actually reads it, because the Hebrew looks like the people were under the mountain. And the rabbis in the commentary say, God lifted Mount Sinai over the head of the Israelites and said, do you want the Torah? Of course they said yes. They didn't really have a choice, right? And I think I think that's really important, because you can't escape it, right? And you have to, whether you like it or not, that is what it means to be a Jew, to be a part of that struggle, specifically with Israel today. And that's a major part of this, of course, along with everything else, along with the denominations, along with living in America, along with everything that we didn't necessarily choose. And I think, and I would say, I think even those who are quote unquote Jews by choice often say they also didn't choose. They were called to Judaism. They had a Jewish soul. They were always meant to be Jewish. And that struggle was always there for them, perhaps. Yeah. This was absolutely wonderful. Thank you all so much for a great discussion. You all really had so much to add, and I look forward to lots more. Have a wonderful night, everyone.